Welcome to day 182 of our 2020 Focus Bible reading. We are looking at the letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 5. And this is what we read. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions so that no one will be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. The elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For Scripture says, "Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it is brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. But those elders who are sinning you are to reprove before everyone, so that the others may take warning. I charge you, in the sight of God and Christ and the elect angels, to keep these instructions without partiality and to do nothing out of favoritism. Do not be hasty in laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Stop drinking only water, and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever." All right, so he's now giving some instruction to Timothy to pass along. And so part of this is instruction to Timothy himself, and then this is the other part of the pastoral aspect of it. This is like Paul saying, and this is what I teach. And so Timothy, as a disciple of Christ, but also a follower of Paul, because he's learning from Paul, is wanting this kind of instruction. It's practical instruction for ministry purposes. Now, there is an aspect to this that is absolutely cultural. That's a cultural artifact, because the times have changed and there are other systems in place. But I think there's some interesting things to learn from this. I think there's some principles we can take away, even if the prescription that he's given is different in our era, in our day and age, than it was in the ancient world. So the first thing, I think this is, the older I get, the more verse 1 means to me. Reading this 30 years ago is like, okay, whatever. But, do not rebuke an older man harshly. I have to say I really appreciate this verse, and I think it's important. But the idea that you would treat those around you in the family of faith as your family. You see older men as your father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters. That's just an important reality that we need to keep in mind, that we are family, and that's the way we treat each other. Then he goes into, and twice within this little section on widows, give proper recognition to the widows who are really in need, verse 3. And then verse 5, he says, the widow who is really in need. So there is a need, there is a testing of the need. One of the most difficult things that we've had to navigate as a church, especially a church that is striving to be generous in our community, that we want to be good neighbors, and we are not interested in hoarding. We're not interested in being greedy. When we have extra, we want to share that extra. So we manage our budget accordingly. We even prioritize generosity within our budget. And as a church, but we will get calls from people inside and outside the church for help from time to time for things. And we have developed a system of not just simply responding to the request by just giving, but to actually identify the need. To see what's really there. If somebody says, "Hey, I need help because my gas is going to get cut off because I haven't been paying," one of the questions we ask is, "Well, we can help you this month. I mean, we're not unwilling to help in a pinch. Emergencies happen, things happen, but we'll ask the question, what's going to prevent this from being a problem next month?" Because there's a need here, and we need to know the need, not just the symptoms. Another question we'll often ask is, have you talked to family? Again, because this is a principle that we learn in the scriptures, that if there is family to help, that's the front line of need. And you have people who've burned their bridges with their families. And so sometimes that's not an option. But if they haven't, there's an option that we want to include the family in this, especially if they're Christians. Because the scriptures are clear, we are to care for each other. And again, he does talk about the fact that there are some people who just, they take advantage, and you don't want that to happen. And so we set up systems to not only help people with a systemic problem that they may be having in their lives. We also know that we don't want to just be taken advantage of, because people will do that. And very often, actually, what we discover is those who are reaching out for need, once they learn we have kind of a system in place, they often jump out because it's easy enough for them to find another person who's just going to respond without having to answer uncomfortable questions, because they're gaming the system, not actually in need. Not that they don't have issues. Oh my goodness, there's usually a cascade of things, but we can't help them if they're not going to allow us to help them in a way that's holistic and not just, hey, we'll pay a bill. And so we've had to measure that out. We, as a church, we've had to determine what is our steps for figuring this out and how can we help. And we have been incredibly generous. It's not something that you get to see because it deals with individuals and their personal needs. And so we don't trumpet the giving. But when you give to Keystone, you need to know that part of your giving goes to that. And when we can resource somebody not only by paying a bill or even paying 2 months worth of a bill so that they don't run into this problem the next month, that they really do get back on their feet. That's our goal, and we partner with great organizations that help that happen as well. Because it's funny, out of an entire letter where there's 6 chapters in this letter, look how much time the Apostle Paul is spending on this. The care of widows, the care of people in need. Because in the ancient world, if you were a woman who was a widow, you lost your source of income. Very often, the widow was one who was looking for their husband and their children to support them because they did not necessarily have an occupation that would. They didn't own things in the ancient world, unless you were a wealthy woman. And so for these women, they were often in desperate times. That's why the Apostle Paul also comes back and says, and for younger widows, I tell them to get married and have children, because that was the system of support. That wasn't just a patriarchy. That wasn't just the Apostle Paul saying a woman's place is only in the home. No, he's saying, no, this is a support. This is the welfare net that was cast in the first century world. That having family was the primary means of support for women in that culture. So the Apostle Paul isn't trying to restrict them. He's trying to actually make sure that they have provision. So you need to read these things in that context, because a lot of times you read that and then you can kind of draw some conclusions, because we live in such a different context. That wasn't the way of the world back then, and so he's dealing with the people in their position in that world. And verse 17, he goes into, all right, Preaching and teaching is an important function within the church, and this needs to remain central. He's talking to a guy, writing to a guy who is a preacher and teacher, as well as an overseer. So he's trying to reinforce the fact that, hey, this is an important role. This is one of the primary tasks that the church is here to do. Yes, we want to meet needs, but we don't do that at the expense of also providing the word. That these things are need to be done equally, and so that's an important part of what we're trying to do also. And then just one little note, I grew up in a tradition where alcohol, we were teetotalers. We were part of a tradition a church tradition that stood behind the Prohibition movement, because alcohol was such an evil in the culture and ruining so many lives that the church came along and said, this needs to end. We can help society by banning this thing. And then Prohibition ended. Well, in certain churches, Prohibition never really ended. It became kind of but if you come here and you believe, then this is what we would encourage you to do. The Wesleyan church that we're a part of is one that used to have membership standards that said you had to abstain from alcohol. We still require that of those in leadership for Keystone, not because we think that alcohol is the primary issue. We want to be careful about it. And obviously, Timothy was drinking only water. Paul has to come along and say, hey, no, for your benefit, add some wine into that. There was a medicinal aspect. And now some people will say, well, then it was just for medicinal purposes. I would remind you, Jesus manufactured the best wine that had ever been made. So I understand, but my conviction is still not to drink alcohol, because I think it's best for those that I minister to, especially those who struggle with alcoholism. I have no need to be a person who causes them to stumble. That doesn't mean that my conviction is everybody's conviction, and I think that's what everybody should do. But I think it's a pastoral decision, and it's a conviction that I have, and it's something that I think we drink as a culture way more than we should. I think there are a lot of people who are dealing with alcoholism without even realizing it, because there is no counterpoint to say, hey, we need to be careful here. Everything in moderation. And so that's the side that I live on. But again, that's a pastoral teaching within a context, and I think it's an important thing that he brings up, and it's counter to what the tradition I grew up. I honestly don't remember ever memorizing verse 23 of 1 Timothy chapter 5. But I get it, and we can't walk away from what the scriptures actually say. So anyway, that's it for today. We will see you tomorrow.